Hello classes, welcome to more digital learning. So I'm going to be covering what we need to know for this unit for Andrew Jackson. If you want to skip straight ahead to content, I'll put the comment for which minute and second you need to go to in the comments later. I did want to start out with a little game though. You can really draw a lot of comparisons from Andrew Jackson to Donald Trump. So I'm going to start out with a few quotes. Play along if you'd like. I'll post a quote, I'll give you a few seconds, think about who you think said it, and then I'll advance the slide, and you can just judge yourself and see how you did. So this one's been up, so I'll just go ahead and advance. That one was said by Donald Trump. Next up, I have always been afraid of banks. That one was definitely Andrew Jackson. This is also a joke. If you want to prove you watched a video, you can go to the end and post a comment. This is a funny joke, by the way. Irony is Andrew Jackson's face on a central banknote. That is a funny joke. And at the end of this PowerPoint presentation, if you cannot explain why that is a funny joke, you need to go back and redo it. By the way, referring to today's $20 bill, if you were not aware. Next quote. It is always good to be underestimated. Trump or Jackson? That one was Trump. Next up, it was settled by the Constitution, the laws, and the whole practice of the government that the entire executive power is vested in the President of the United States. Really quick, do you think it was Trump or Jackson? Well, it was Andrew Jackson. Next up, then I have an Article 2, where I have the right to do whatever I want as president. Won't leave you guessing too long. That one was Donald Trump. The Bible is the rock on which this republic rests. That one was Andrew Jackson. In America, we don't worship government. We worship God. This one was said by Donald Trump. The planter, the farmer, the mechanic, and the laborer formed a great body of the people of the United States. They are the bone and sinew of the countrymen who love liberty and desire nothing but equal rights and equal laws. Who do you think said it? It was Jackson. No dream is too big, no challenge is too great, nothing we want for our future is beyond our reach. That one is Trump. This should be the last one. Heaven will be no heaven to me if I do not meet my wife there. This one I want to explain the context of. It is Andrew Jackson. Nothing I've said so far, something else show up on a test, but I do think understanding this relationship can help you understand the kind of character Andrew Jackson is. His wife's name is Rachel, and she dies just before he becomes president. He loved his wife immensely for their 30-some-odd years of marriage. There is a backstory to her, though. She is actually definitely a woman who took life into her own hands. She actually left her husband, which in the 1790s, early 1800s, that is not a thing you do as a woman. Especially. Divorces, breaking up marriages, that was just not a thing. The only way you got away from your spouse was if they died. She actually left her husband and left him for Andrew Jackson. And they were living together. They called themselves a married couple before they formalized their divorce. And that's going to become a thing in an election in a minute. The election of 1824 and the election of 1828, especially the election of 1828, is widely regarded as one of the dirtiest, nastiest elections in history. And her past actually became a major part of it. They were claiming Andrew Jackson was not suitable for the White House because his wife was a harlot. She was a whore, and she was not worthy of being the First Lady of the United States. And it really, really bothered her, as you can imagine why. And she ends up dying just before Andrew Jackson would have been able to take the White House. And Andrew Jackson widely held his political opponents responsible for his wife Rachel's death. He actually had a pocket watch And every night before he went to sleep, he would actually open up his pocket watch and talk to his wife. A very sweet story, and it really sets the tone for a lot of what Andrew Jackson's presidency is like. So we'll go ahead and move on. I'll try to cover the important things. There's two characters here that are important to his administration. Now, as far as a character who is most influential politician in American history who was never a president, I think you would have to make a case that that's Henry Clay. And when he died, this is the kind of bitterness he held. John C. Calhoun is actually his vice president at one point. 1824 is the election that sets up 1828. This one's not too important. But you may notice here, he wins. If you look at the popular vote share, he won. This is important. He won that, but he does not win enough electoral votes. It ends up going to the U.S. House, where the corrupt bargain sets up that Henry Clay convinces the House to vote for John Quincy Adams, the son of the last John Adams, who was president. And Jackson supporters see this as like the election was snatched away from him again. Go back and look at these results on the last slide, and you'll see he won the popular vote, but he does not win this. And by the way, going back to that, Henry Clay does become Secretary of State after he convinces the U.S. House to vote for John Quincy Adams. The thing is that Thomas Jefferson has been a vice president. Thomas Jefferson has been a president. He has also been a Secretary of State before he was president. Monroe and Madison were Secretary of State. To be Secretary of State meant that you were kind of grooming yourself to be the President of the United States one day. A minor thing, too, is that most states required you own property to vote. A lot of Jackson supporters are poor people who do not own property. Once states removed the property qualification for voting, poor white males are able to vote. And that really sets up John Quincy Adams for failure in 1828. Andrew Jackson becomes the president. It does come up when he is president, for instance, that he has this bullet next to his heart. It actually starts bothering his shoulder. And years later, they extract a bullet from him while he's president. It had been there for years. John Quincy Adams is a lot like his father. If you had my class for this, in class one day we talked. I showed you guys some John Adams quotes rather, and John Adams is certainly a man who has not a lot of love for anyone else. If you remember those quotes, John Quincy Adams, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. And this time, if you go back and compare this, look at the popular vote and the electoral vote share. Jackson wins a landslide election in 1828. Remember, this is a nasty election. His wife became part of it and everything, and it is the beginning of the modern Democratic Party. And they have existed in some form or another, and have fielded a candidate for president every year since. He does invent the spoils system, which, by the way, why it's called this, he has a quote where he says, "To the victors go the spoils." And his thing was that if you win an election, then you won. It's totally up to you who you appoint. So the people he appoints to government positions are oftentimes just his own friends, his supporters who got him to where he is. Whereas before, you take George Washington. George Washington found the best and the brightest people that he could to back him up and be in his cabinet to whatever post may be. Andrew Jackson's not like that. Andrew Jackson thinks an idiot can do government's work, and he does appoint unqualified people, but they basically had supported the right man. Andrew Jackson can make a case for it's not what you know, it's who you know. We're going to skip the Peggy Eaton affair, but I'll leave it up for a few seconds just in case somebody does want to read about it. What we do need to know for this class, as I'm recording this for digital learning, going through the COVID-19 crisis, the Tariff of 1828. That's its official name. It ends up being called by Southerners particularly the Tariff of Abominations. The Tariff of Abominations is, as it states here, a high tariff on British materials. it was, and as far as who hates it, mainly Southerners. It causes Southerners who, by the way, remember, they don't produce anything. Southerners often depend on cheaper industrial goods coming from other countries, and they make their money, remember, primarily through agricultural things. Primarily, cotton is king for them. And so, the Tariff of Abomination sets up another important idea that will, we're going to skip over that part. By 1832, if you go back and remember, there was the nullification with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's presidency. There was the idea of nullification in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. The idea of nullification comes up again. Now, remember, if you're not aware, nullification is the idea that a state could ignore a federal law. Well, the Tariff of Abominations is really hurting the South. It's helping the North. And South Carolina goes to nullify the tariff. Now, if you remember, there was a quote I showed at the beginning of this that had to do with Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. And Andrew Jackson's, one of his dying regrets was that he did not hang John C. Calhoun. Now, here's the context for that. John C. Calhoun was a Southerner who was Andrew Jackson's vice president. John C. Calhoun, as vice president, is encouraging the state of South Carolina to nullify a federal law. And Andrew Jackson is not in support of that. It's very unusual. It goes back to like before we had a time when a president and vice president would not even be from the same party. If you'll remember John Adams and Thomas Jefferson being president and vice president against each other. It really recalls those days. And Jackson regards John C. Calhoun as a traitor for this. So Jackson sends the U.S. military to Charleston to enforce the tariff. And he actually has a thing where he's at a dinner party one night and he says, "To the Union, may it never be broken," as his toast. Now, who ends up saving the day? There is a politician he's been around since the Missouri Compromise. He is the arch nemesis, ironically, to Andrew Jackson. And Henry Clay does propose a system to end this whole crisis with South Carolina to reduce the tariff. Which it ends up being a win for everybody. Jackson gets to, tout that he won. South Carolina doesn't succeed, but at the same time, South Carolina gets lower taxes. And South Carolina, by the way, this crisis was at the point that South Carolina was threatening to leave the Union if they were not allowed to nullify this law and possibly start the U.S. Civil War 30 years early. And that does not happen. And Henry Clay, honestly, if it wasn't for Henry Clay, perhaps the Civil War started even sooner than it did. It would not be fair to talk about Andrew Jackson, by the way, without mentioning what is easily the biggest black eye on his whole presidency. Andrew Jackson does order the Indian Removal Act, which goes through Congress, much to Jackson's support. And the Cherokee had fought in American court, which they did adopt some American ways. As it notes here, they had actually adopted slavery, and whereas most Indians did not try to adopt American ways. Remember, Americans compared to Indians, Indians are tribal in society. They don't necessarily have property. They as Americans today, we mark off like this little section of land is mine. We put up a fence around it. This is my house. It's not our house. It's my house. This is my land. This is what I worked for. This is my stuff. Indians, remember, they don't work that way. The Cherokee had, however, adopted some Americans. They had actually set up like this land here in Georgia. This is our land. The Americans don't come here. And when the Americans tried to take it, the Cherokee actually adopted enough Americans that they actually had fought in American court for their land. And the Supreme Court, this is what makes this case a little bit confusing. The Supreme Court actually said the Cherokee Nation was right and ordered that they could not be removed. Andrew Jackson, if you go back and look at those quotes, remember, he is not a man who takes no for an answer. And Andrew Jackson does order anyway, despite the fact that the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of the Indians. He insists that he remove the Indians anyway. And there's books you may have read on this in elementary school. And roughly half of the Cherokee Indians actually make it to the new Indian Territory, which, by the way, is modern-day Oklahoma. In a future unit, we will see what came of that. The thing about Andrew Jackson is you certainly cannot discuss his presidency without discussing this major black eye on it. The path they roughly took, also not necessarily the most direct either. There were also other Indians. The Cherokee are the ones that were famously involved in this. There were other Indian territories, as you can obviously see. The Cherokee, however, have their name on a lot of this because the Cherokee are the ones who fought in the U.S. Supreme Court for their own land. And so the Indians are forcibly removed and at this time taken to Oklahoma for the most part. You can pause the slide and read the quotes if you so wish later. And so going into 1832, Andrew Jackson, I do draw some parallels to Trump because he drew a lot of the same supporters. Andrew Jackson markets himself as a common man's president. And remember, at this time, that often means common, poor white man's president. Remember, women cannot vote. Blacks primarily are slaves. If they are free, they likely do not have the right to vote. Andrew Jackson is running his whole campaign on being the president of the common man. And so he wins overwhelmingly in the Electoral College. And if you look at the other parties, the National Republicans, the Independent Democrats, they're so broken up. Jackson wins a landslide in 1832. And this time, remember there was a joke I told you that you need to know? Well, here is the basis of that joke. This time, Andrew Jackson is going to declare war on the bank. Now, if we go back and if you really study the election of 1832, one of the ways that Henry Clay, one of the ways that those opposing Jackson tried to destroy his campaign was taking the side of the national bank. Andrew Jackson does not like the national bank. For a variety of reasons, banks can pick who they give loans to. Banks can essentially decide which business owner who comes into their bank and requests a loan gets one and does not. In a sense, if you follow this up, banks can then pick winners and losers. And so Jackson wants to end the national bank. It is the second national bank. We're not going to talk about why. The national bank was, remember, the first time it was a big issue was back in George Washington's presidency. And this is back when Hamilton and Jefferson were debating the constitutionality of it. It's pretty well established at this point that the national government has a right to establish a national bank. Now we are kind of arguing about should they. Andrew Jackson, along with most common poor Americans at this time, do not like the National Bank of the United States. And he is certainly in favor of getting rid of it. So what Andrew Jackson starts doing is directing his Secretary of Treasury to remove federal money from the national bank and start putting it in state banks, or as they are most likely called, pet banks. So that's an important concept here. So he starts. It starts becoming an issue in Congress when they pass the charter through Congress. Jackson is vetoing it. And we start seeing at this time the bank, maybe it had a lot more to do with economic stability than we thought it did. And so it starts arguably causes problems after Jackson's already out. Jackson basically stays popular with his supporters. Historians have widely regarded his antagonism towards the national bank and his willingness and his trying to come up with the word here, but his resolve in destroying the national bank as causing the economic panic of 1837. Nowadays we call them recessions. Back then they were called panics. What does happen in regards to Jackson is the new party forms. It will be around until just before the Civil War, known as the Whigs. The Whigs are basically the anti-Andrew Jackson party. Um, Henry Clay, for instance, is a supporter. Basically, anybody who would hate Andrew Jackson is a Whig after his presidency. I don't know as you'd say they're the successors of the Federalists. They're certainly not the Republicans that we have today. The first Republican president will be Abraham Lincoln much later. And so we'll move along from his presidency. But I do want to talk about a couple of big takeaways from Andrew Jackson. Is he a hero or a villain? Honestly, I'm going to say here, it depends on who you ask. Andrew Jackson is the first common man's president. Meaning, he gets along to the people who don't own land. The way he markets himself, the way he appeals is more towards the common man versus the rich landowners. Remember, a lot of our early American presidents are rich. George Washington was an immensely wealthy man. Up until Donald Trump, he was still regarded, adjusted for inflation, as the wealthiest president in American history. George Washington was. Our nation was founded by the wealthy landowners, the plantation owners. Andrew Jackson is the first man who really grew from a poor nobody. He was in the military like Washington, but Washington was an officer and a general early. Andrew Jackson he came in as an enlisted man. He showed promise. He worked his way up. And Andrew Jackson's story was not one of a guy who's born into wealth. It's a story, or at least the way it gets told, of a man who fought and earned for everything he owned. And he was able to relate more on the level of the common American because of that. As far as what we got to look for why is he a villain, though? There's the obvious here. We haven't talked much about slaves. The thing about slave life in his time, my understanding of the history, my argument would be that if you're a slave, it didn't really matter who was president. John Quincy Adams did not do anything more for slaves than Andrew Jackson did. The reality was slave life stays what slave life is. So life doesn't get better for them. Certainly you can also say Andrew Jackson could be a villain who became president. Through some fancy political word game, he basically promised that he was going to move Indians off their land and let poor white people be able to buy that land and farm it. And when he becomes president, he moves Indians off their lands in spite of what the Supreme Court said, in spite of whatever desire an Indian may have. Remember, at that time in America, unfortunately, to be an Indian basically meant you were not even a human being. There is definitely a hierarchy in society that we must remember here. And the highest people in society are landowning white men. And for poor white men, there are still things lower than them. Slaves, Indians. Andrew Jackson is also a man who, remember, he goes after things that he really despises too. If he has a reason to hate it, he thinks it's part of the rich elite. It's Henry Clay's idea, whatever the case may be. He hates the bank. He thinks that is the mark of the rich elitists, and he wants to get rid of it. So you could really make an argument, hero or villain, one way or the other for him. But with that in mind, we'll talk about just briefly what comes after him. Martin Van Buren, who was his second vice president. He does get rid of John C. Calhoun after that whole nullification crisis with South Carolina. Not much to talk about with Martin Van Buren. A very unmemorable president. He doesn't last very long. Coming after him, William Henry Harrison, whose nickname is Tippy Canoe. Goes back a long way. We won't really need to worry about this. What we really need to worry about is Andrew Jackson himself. But for fun, American history, William Henry Harrison, and the shortest lived president of all time. Seriously, he's only president for 30 days before he dies of possibly the flu, possibly pneumonia, after he gave a really long inauguration address, kind of like this PowerPoint's getting on to be. So I need to go ahead and wrap this up. Curse at Tecumseh is something you can Google and look up, but it does have this idea that every 20 years the president who gets elected is going to be cursed in some way. So I'll just go ahead and wrap this up. Certainly, if you have any comments, if you're in my class, you can feel free to send me a remind. You can drop a comment here, and I'll hopefully get to it. Enjoy, and good luck, and hopefully this helps you know everything you need to know about Andrew Jackson.